Hello, everyone. I'm John Greco, founder and chair of the Marketing Impact Council, and welcome to the COVID-19 Reset, Strategy, Marketing, and Communications for a New World. This is the second in a series of council webinars organized and produced in collaboration with our strategic partner, CommunicationsMatch, whose founder and CEO, Simon Erskine-Locke, is co-moderating with me today. Now, for those of you who missed the first webinar in the series, a written recap and a video are available on both the Council as well as the CommunicationsMatch websites. Simon and I would like to recognize and thank our supporting partners, including ComproBiz, led by Faye Shapiro, the Financial Communications Society, led by Kevin Windorf, and Capital Communicator, led by Paul Dunning. We appreciate their support in bringing this to you. Now, we are delighted to have with us today two industry rock stars as our panelists. Former Marketer of the Year and CMO of the Year, Arun Sinha, and Time Magazine Marketing Innovator, Rishad Tobaccowala, to discuss resetting, aligning, and implementing strategy, marketing, and communications in our COVID-19 impacted world. As a former global CMO of JP Morgan and of Zurich Financial, where he was also Chief Communications Officer, global CMO of MSCI, and President of Services and Solutions and CMO of Pitney Bowes, he is a business leader, an entrepreneur, an author, and a Yale School of Management Senior Faculty Fellow. Now, I had the pleasure of working closely with Arun when he was on the executive committee of the board of the DMA, where I was CEO. Rishad is a senior advisor to and former chief strategy and growth officer of the Publicis Group, and is a past chairman of Digitas LBI and Razorfish. His advisory clients also include global private equity and venture capital firms such as Growth Catalyst Partners and technology platforms such as Crisp Thinking. He was recognized by Businessweek as one of the top business leaders for his pioneering innovation, and he is the author of Restoring the Soul of Business, Staying Human in the Age of Data. And you can find that by just typing his first name on Amazon. And now I'd like to thank both Arun and Rishad for taking the time to be part of today's webinar. Each brings unique perspective and insights into ways business, marketing, and communications leaders can approach the COVID-19 challenge, as well as perspective on what companies are doing to execute a value-based reset. The idea of value is at the heart of the Marketing Impact Council. Our value equation is an acronym and a mnemonic for vision, alignment, leadership, understanding, and execution across functions. These 5 drivers must be continuously optimized and integrated to create the maximum value for all stakeholders and to apply equally to both for-profit and nonprofit entities. We provide members tools and access to resources to unlock value, such as this webinar, that help council members address the question, if you had only $1 more to invest, how would you invest it to create the greatest sustainable impact on the value of your entity and brand? Now, please visit our website, mktgimpactcouncil.com, to learn more about the benefits of membership in the council. Simon, would you like to say a few words about CommunicationsMatch?
Sure, thanks, John. I'll keep it super brief. So CommunicationsMatch is an agency, consultant, and freelancer search platform. It allows companies to search more than 6,000 agencies and professionals by areas of expertise, and it generates, as a result, qualified new business leads for listed resources. We just recently launched Agency Select RFP tools, which streamline the hiring process and helpfully and improve search outcomes. And by combining the expertise of our search consultants and technology, we're actually delivering a new range of cost-effective agency search options for our clients. And so there's more on that at communicationsmatch.com. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Simon. As we now turn to Arun and Rishad, let me remind our audience to feel free to submit questions throughout the Q&A area in your screen, and we'll try to do our best to address some of those questions later in the program. Arun, let me start with you. Given your personal, broad, global, cross-industry experience in both B2B and B2C, and especially with your financial services background as well, as well as what you're hearing from others in your network, not just your own perspective, but what you're hearing. What insights can you share with us on how to best integrate strategy, marketing, and communications to provide the greatest value for all of the stakeholders that our audience is facing in this COVID-19 reset process?
Thank you, John. When I talk to a lot of companies on a regular basis, right? So there are two phases to it. The first phase is the very short term, where most of the companies are focused on well-being of the employees and customers, right? So that's the first focus. They want to make sure that the employees are safe, and then they, whatever services they can provide to their customers, right? But when you get beyond that, so midterm, I would call that midterm, this crisis is bringing about an amazing amount of changes, massive changes, right? But it's not all new. It's like whatever the changes were happening, it's been accelerated at a much faster rate than what has been in the past, right? And the companies, and we have seen that, from the previous recessions and all that, the companies which can adapt to all these changes well are the ones who are going to be the winners and be successful and build a long-term value for their employees, for their stakeholders and all that, right? So let me talk a little bit about what are those consumer changes that we are seeing, right? So there are some very critical ones, and which everybody is painfully aware of that right now, is the economic insecurity. With so many people and unemployed, 15% of the population unemployed, 39 million or 40 million, whatever count you look at it, right? Primarily, first thing is happening is consumers are focused on essentials, not discretionary. Those two things are really a critical part of it, essentials versus discretionary. Deal seeking, a lot of promotional things are happening from a deal standpoint and all that, right? And previous recessions have told us that consumers will be trading down, will be basically moving to some private labels and all that. Although this time it is a little complicated because all the goods were all the goods were coming from different parts of the world. Now the supply chain has been disrupted. So time will tell how the consumers are going to adapt to that part of it, right? The second big change that we are seeing is the rise in digital. And this is not digital in just the e-commerce approach or shopping approach or the channel preference and all that, but primarily every touch point that the consumers are going through. And it's up to the companies to provide solutions to those touch points from an experience standpoint, right? The third is the rise in wellness and hygiene. And we all know that, and there's tons of things going on, so I don't need to get into that part of it, but the fitness element of it and how people are doing. But one which I am very looking at it very closely is people nesting at home. So they are upgrading to their home and garden stuff, refocusing on the home occasions. Equipments and hobbies, weightlifting equipments have gone up 300%. We were talking about earlier that bread maker has gone up like 600% increase in bread maker demand kind of thing. Cleaning supplies, so nesting, computer monitors have gone up on 200%. All of these things are really bringing back to your home element of it, right? The fifth is the brand preference. And that is really near and dear to my heart. A lot of is going on is connecting it to purpose of the brand, higher purpose of the brand. And you see tons of companies focusing on that area. Unilever is spending $100 million plus 550 million with the suppliers. Facebook is spending $100 million in that world. You name it. I mean, every company is trying to connect to the higher purpose with their brand, right? Some successful companies. And then the last piece of change that is happening is the media consumption. So, the way the media is changing and all that. Now, what companies are doing to be successful if you want me to talk about it this or later on, but there are 4 trends I'm seeing which companies are doing extremely well, and we can tackle at the later stage.
That's great. That's great. We will definitely come back to that. So Rishad, basically the same question for you, giving your global cross-industry experience, but also, with the perspective of the lens of an agency, the agency arena, what are you hearing and seeing in your network, and what insights would you like to share with us on this?
So I'll build on Arun's, which I agree with everything that he has basically sort of seen. So the good news is both of us are living on Earth and not one on Earth and one on Mars. So that is good. I'll start also with people. So the key thing that we're looking at is fragility. So fragility is, there are 3 emotions that we're seeing in people. One is anxiety about their health. The other one is fear about their financial futures and their jobs. And the third is uncertainty about when this will end and what the world will look like. And if you think about that, they are basically fragile. And as a result, they're looking for safety and for security and for value. You also see the fragility in society, where the frontline workers are 1/3 immigrants, so that people know the United States is 16% immigrants. The frontline workers are 1/3 immigrants. That the 60% of the people who cannot do their job from home, only 40% can do their job from home, are taking the brunt of both the disease as well as like here in Chicago, 1/3 of the city is African-American, but almost 2/3 of the COVID-19 deaths are African-American. So you're basically seeing sort of society fractures. And the biggest one really is when you've got 30 million people unemployed, it brings to mind that tying in healthcare with a job is the stupidest thing anybody ever thought about, right? So there's some implications there. And then you see fragility of business. And to a great extent, many business leaders have so optimized their stock price that they didn't even do well by the business part of their company. So think about something like Boeing. The amount of money that they gave back in stock buybacks is the amount of money they now have to basically borrow, right? And they're in a cyclical business. And if you're in a cyclical business and you have no room for error, don't tell me you're a good leader. Forget about the fact that you can't tell truth about 737 MAX, right? So there's the fragility of business, there's the fragility of society, and the fragility of individuals is what we're basically sort of seeing across the board.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. Both bringing some excellent opening perspective here. Simon, do you have a couple of follow-up questions here?
Yes, maybe we can, can be a question actually for both Arun and Rishad, because it follows on our sort of preamble conversation. This idea of accelerating change, what does that mean? I think both, as you think about this more broadly and maybe can think of some specific examples, but also both from a communications and marketing perspective, are there multiple dimensions of the way we should be thinking about this idea of accelerating change and what it will mean? And maybe we can start with you, Arun.
Yeah, so one example I'll give you is a simple example of connecting brand to the higher purpose, right? So remember last year, Business Executive Council, they talked about we need to change our focus from shareholder focus to getting to stakeholders. Then followed by, BlackRock, Larry Fink talked about, how we need to focus on the sustainability, climate change, and all of those elements of it. In financial services, the biggest change that is happening is connecting all the financial instruments to ESG. So at MSCI, when I worked at MSCI, the fastest growing business of MSCI was ESG related, which is rating, research, and finally having some index related to ESG. So compared to any other business, ESG was growing 50% year over year. That's a huge trend going on in there, right? So connecting it to the brand, to the higher purpose is the main thing that is connecting everywhere. I mean, we saw that yesterday. Jamie Dimon, just prior to their shareholder meeting, he sends out a memo to all the employees saying that, hey, we need to think about all the people who are not faring so well in this economy. So there is an underlying thing which is going on among all the leaders, business leaders across the globe, saying that we need to connect that dot here.
Rishad, do you have some perspective on this conversation about acceleration?
Yeah, there are four forms of acceleration. The first is we have to also recognize that obviously while we are here in May 2020, we look back and sometimes we forget that December 2019 was also a turbulent time. You know, we sort of look back at it with like these rosy glasses, like they were the 1950s. They were not. So we already had 3 significant shifts coming on 2019 globally, but let's just look at the United States. One was we were at the cusp of a new age of technology. So the last time we had a big recession, and this is much worse than that because this is an economic and a financial, social, political, as well as health issue. The last time we think of something like this, which is the Great Recession, we were also launching what I call the second connected age. And the second connected age, so the first connected age was about search and e-commerce, and the second one was about mobile and social. They build on each other. We are about to basically, and are in the midst of 4 big shifts. One is basically connecting to data, which is machine learning has taken, a big move, which is AI. The next one is things connecting to things, including the cloud, which is IoT and cloud. The third one is new ways of connecting, of which voice is the big interface. And the fourth is much faster ways of connecting, of which 5G is the big one. And so we were already at, that was one from a technology perspective. We were having globalization shifting and changing, and we were having significant demographic shifts. In the United States, 10,000 people were turning 60 every day. Next year, under 21, we will be Caucasian minority, right? So we already had these things roiling, and now we have this happen. So what are the things that have accelerated? Without a doubt, the digitization of business is accelerated by 3 to 5 years. So every single senior leader who was resistant to change has basically been zoomed into the future in the last 6 to 8 weeks, right? I talked with a lot of senior people who were like, I don't know when this is going to happen, how it's going to happen. Now they are running their entire companies virtually. And they're saying, why the hell did we not understand this? So that's number one. The second one, to a great extent, is a basic change in omni. And I'm not calling it omni-channel, it's omni everything. So no longer are you going to basically have a business that's offline and online. All businesses are going to be mongrel, right? So I use sort of mongrel versus omni. So it's going to be offline and online businesses. It's going to basically be multiple supply chains because you're going to basically have supply chains based on resilience and not on lowest cost. Wendy's ran out of burgers because they did not have a resilient supply chain. And so people are going to basically say, hey, look, we are not going to get all of our stuff from China. We have to get it from other places too. It's one of the biggest things that people didn't realize is yesterday, TSMC, which is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, which is the biggest fabricator of all the chips in the world. They and Samsung are the big people, and they're in Korea and Taiwan. TSMC just announced a $12 billion plant that they're basically going to create in Arizona. So people are going to basically recognize you can't basically be in just one area. So there's optionality. Every business is going to have to have a carry-out version. So every restaurant is going to basically have pick-up and drive-through. And every conference and every academic thing is going to basically combine real world and virtual. And this is perpetual. Okay, this is where the world is going. So that's the second one. So there's digitization, there is omni, which is the second one. And third, without a doubt, is the purpose and value part of it, which is most of us have gone through a near-death experience, or we've seen someone go through a near-death experience, and a lot of people are basically saying, I got to rethink my life. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Where am I working? And so a lot of people obviously are going to think about purpose, values, and personal growth.
You know, I'd like to explore something with both of you, because I think there's a need for an increased awareness of all of the resources that we have available to us at this time. And what I mean by that is, Arun, you know, when you think about being a CMO, CCO, you know, leading all the organizations that you've led in those areas and in all the industries, you didn't do it alone, and you didn't do it with your internal teams. You rely heavily on agencies, right? And consultants and freelancers and resources externally, technology providers. So when you think about the relationship with all of those suppliers and partners, if you really want them to be the greatest help to you right now, and you think about the network of those out there, what are the kinds of things they might be able to be doing differently, or that you'd expect them to be doing differently now, to help you accelerate the reset going forward?
Yeah. So, you know, and you're very familiar with the marketing does not work. Marketing group generally in companies are very small, and we have a broader ecosystem that helps us execute everything. So I would categorize it to 4 parts, how they can help us, you know, to move forward. Number 1, most companies right now that I know of, and you know that at Yale we had about 10 CMOs in our class last quarter. All 10 of them, we basically said that they are changing their marketing plan. So marketing mix is changing. So we need help with the execution of those marketing mix changes. That's the first thing that the agencies, consultants and others can help us really figure this out. How do we really execute? The bottom line is, this is the time when the marketing services firms that always served as vendors to these companies have an opportunity to become partners with these companies. And it's really, they can get the seat at the table, because without the execution capabilities, the marketing group cannot make those changes. And plus, these changes are basically not a yearly changes. These are the changes that you're thinking about is a weekly, monthly, daily kind of changes. So you really need, you know, all that help. You know, I'm on a board of a company called Bounteous, and Bounteous does digital transformation, primarily all the, you know, touch points of wherever the consumers or customers they want. They do it digital. Their business is right now is amazingly hot. Last quarter, every business is struggling. Last quarter, they had a record quarter. This quarter, you know, last month and this month, they've had amazing run, 24% year-over-year growth. Because why that is happening is because those kinds of skill sets are needed at the company. So that's number 1. Number 2, I would say is agile marketing. Now, all the marketing companies are thinking about the demand forecast and all of those things, not an yearly thing. It used to be early planning, and you figure it out, and then in January you kick it off, and then you lay out the plan and you execute throughout the year. Those days are gone. We really have to respond to on a much faster timeline. And we have tools today. We have amazing number of tools that are available that can take a, you know, daily, weekly, monthly kind of an approach. And that's where, again, our partners can be very helpful. And to Rishad's point, you know, that he was talking about digitization, right? Digitization on their own, any company to do it is almost virtually impossible. You need to bring in that ecosystem to really make that digitization happen, right? So the bottom line, I would say that all of these partners that we have, they finally have a seat at the table. And they have the same respect that anybody else would have now. The question is, some would really flourish, others would really go by the wayside. So who can tailor their business accordingly?
So Rishad, from not only the agency perspective that you clearly bring, but also your other advisory roles in private equity firms and businesses they're investing in, whatever. But thinking primarily from the agency side of this, how do you see that resetting? Some of what Arun said in terms of actually happening, and also what kinds of things should the client be doing to really take the maximum advantage of what the agencies can do? And, if you look at it through the lens of the agency, how do you see that evolving?
So, before I stopped working as an employee of Publicis last year, although I continue to be attached to them, I had worked in the business for 40 years and I'd seen a lot of shifts and changes. And about starting 20 years ago, the general basis belief was that agencies were dead, right? There was a Wired magazine cover with the Pillsbury Doughboy blindfolded. And I still have it because almost all the advertisers in that have gone out of business. The Wired almost went out of business, but the agency business kept on. But it's a different agency business. So when people call agencies dinosaurs, I say it's not true. We're cockroaches, okay? So what we do is we scurry around and we reinvent ourselves, and nobody really likes us, but we figure out a way to keep going because there has to be a market need. Maybe we just eat all the food that's left over or whatever. But with that being said, there's a big evolution, and the challenges in evolution is very broad. And right now, even before the downturn, Wall Street or the bourse did not actually believe we were going to make it to the other side. So most agencies basically are at an all-time low valuation, even before COVID-19. So there's some question. What I do believe what people are looking for, to the point that Arun has mentioned, is a couple of things. I think we're going much more into the marketing and business transformation business than about communication. That communication by itself will be in, and I think advertising is in long-term secular decline. If you think about advertising as broadcast messages that interrupt content, long-term secular decline. We've made a bet that it is in long-term secular decline, and we basically spent $10 billion actually moving into marketing and business transformation away from communication in acquisitions like Digitas, Razorfish, Sapient, and most recently Epsilon. So I'll give you in the last 10 years, 10 years ago, our company, and I think most of our competitors are doing something of the same. So it's not like the company I was at, but was 8% of our business was digital. The last time we measured in this mongrel world was 2017, it was 54%. Today we basically have 80 out of our 80,000 employees, 24,000 of them are in India. 10 years ago, there was 1,000 in India. Out of our 80,000 people, we have 28,000 engineers. We had 1,000 engineers. So we're basically seeing a very big difference because the clients' needs are very different. The other thing that clients are not willing to pay for, not only do they want speed, but they're not paying for any duplication. So to a great extent, we are sort of de-emphasizing not the culture of our brands, but our different brands, because it was too confusing. Because what clients want is basically, I want solutions, I want them at speed, and I want them at value. So how do you define and redefine? We're going through the process as everybody else, but people are basically saying, just solve for me. And if you can solve something at a good value, at a speed, there is massive demand. And in fact, post-COVID-19, I think there's going to be more massive demand for two reasons. One is every business is going to have to accelerate their digitization. And there just isn't enough supply of people who can do that because Accenture, Deloitte, Sapient, they're all tapped. So that's one part of it. But the second one is most companies have also recognized, as Airbnb and all these companies are doing, is you got to focus on what you're good and you got to have a very flexible cost structure, which basically means what you can outsource, you can outsource. You don't outsource everything, but what you can outsource, you should outsource for two simple reasons. One is you can go up and down based on what you need, which is flexibility and including skills. But the other one is it's really hard to fire yourself. It's really easy to fire an agency. So I think right now we're in the curve where right now everybody, again, including the market, we're like out of business. But I think we're going to be fine as long as we sort of transition. But it's to the point of, are you solving a problem of marketing and business transformation? Are you doing it with a valuable pricing and at speed?
I was asked a question this weekend. We think about solving problems and what we're used to and the kinds of habits that we have and addressing all the things that we're all talking about here today. And someone posed a question to me this weekend, and I said, you know what, that's a great question. Let me use it in the panel coming up, because I think that the two panelists are going to have much better thoughts on it than I do. And it has to do with the fact that so many of our processes in marketing communications processes are driven by models and data sets, historical data sets that are completely outdated because behavior is radically changing, as we've talked about here. So when people are thinking about doing scenario planning and trying to figure out what are we doing short-term, mid-term, long-range, et cetera, and all of this, and they're doing it with completely outdated models, what advice would you give them in terms of how to navigate through that so that they don't just revert back to the spreadsheet or the data set and think that that's going to have all the answers for them going forward?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say, that frustration is going to stay. Sorry, I wish I had a quick answer to that, it will go away. That is going to stay. But what makes me more positive about optimistic about the whole thing is that we have tools to deal with that. So there are models that we have built, and from a demand standpoint, what is the scenario planning standpoint, all kinds of models that we have. We generally use those models and work through with that, right? But what we did not have in the past is the way to respond to it really fast, learn from it, and then adjust the model based on that, because that process would take a long time. That process would take 6 months, a year, and then you say, okay, by then the model is outdated again. Now I feel that we have ways to test all of those things. You can basically, from start to finish a campaign, you can launch it in 3 or 4 days. When I came to this in the business world, campaigning if it was in a year's time frame, that was really amazing. The car companies used to do it every fall, and they would work. The moment they would launch, they would start thinking about the campaign for next year's launch. Those days are gone.
Right.
Because now we can test and learn, quickly adjust to things, see where we are making progress or not, and adjust the models as a result of that. That's what I mean by agile marketing, right? So I think the companies have to think about what are the different scenario plannings and all those things they need to do. And then the second thing I would say, which is changing quite a bit, and all the marketers, communicators have to start thinking about, is that the value proposition of the companies are changing. Why you providing to your consumers and customers, and it's not the how part, but the why and what part is changing slightly. And I think the value proposition needs to be revised for most companies that is in business today.
Rishad, I would think that the data versus human side of this would be just central to the future here in terms of the human judgment, as you talk about so eloquently in your book. Any thoughts on this particular question?
Yeah, so I've done a lot in the world of data, and I have an advanced degree in mathematics and MBA in finance, and been leading a lot of this. And I believe data is so important that it's like electricity. No business can do without it. And right now, for the last 2-3 years, we've been in this phase for most businesses, moving from sort of the steam age to the electric age. And therefore, they're basically emphasizing data, which is very important. However, I need to also remind people that while electricity is core to how businesses run today, tell me which company differentiates itself on the use of electricity, by the use of electricity, right? And so just because we're in the transition, we are over-fixating, rightfully so, on data. But outside of a few institutions, many people cannot really separate themselves on data, right? It basically becomes an input. And so a lot of what I say is we are too fixated on the math and we're not thinking enough about the meaning. So what do people add to data? Which is they add imagination, they add intuition, you need to also have inclusiveness and diversity. Different people can look at the same data and read it differently. But the most scary thing about people who only make data-driven decisions and use Excel spreadsheets to decide what they do, and I tell this to folks, and they get so worked up that they say, my God, I never thought about this. So I said, if you're making all your decisions through data, do you realize that you don't have a job anymore? Because in every case, including lawyers, so if a lawyer basically looks at an NDA, they did an experiment. They basically had 20 lawyers look at an NDA for loopholes. And most of the lawyers on average basically found 96% of the loopholes, but it took them 15 minutes. An AI machine found 99.8% in 5 seconds. So my basic belief, and then the other one is I asked them, can you tell me about the last 10 decisions you've made? Just tell me. And they tell me what they bought, where they went. And I said, tell me how you use data and how you use the rest of your life. And I believe that people choose with their hearts and they use numbers to justify what they just did. So I said, you don't do this in real life. You cannot differentiate your company and you lose your job if you're all data driven. Now tell me more about how this is all about data. Nobody ever, nobody then continues to have this data fixation. None, not even at any company. In fact, when I spoke to 600 people at Google, they specifically told me that they wanted me to speak about why data was not so critical. And they are one of the companies that uses data to differentiate and will always do.
Well, that ties, very much into the what I mentioned earlier, about the counsel and the value equation that we talk about. And I've had to address with many people and they say, but John, you say that the counsel, one of the things that you profess is be data driven and channel agnostic and technology neutral. And I always say, well, yeah, data driven, but not driving yourself off of a cliff with it. We mean by that, let the data help you pick which channels work most effectively, be objective, and let a human being use it and you apply their judgment to it to say what else has to be brought into the equation. So thank you both for those comments, and they really resonate with certainly the way I think about it. Simon, I think we have some, you've been watching questions.
We do.
Audience, you have some. If you could take a few of those, that would be great.
So what I'm going to do as a first one is kind of weave a little bit of some of the threads that I'm seeing in the Q&A that I think also tie into parts of the conversation. And I think one of the things that would be interesting based on what I'm seeing in some of the Q&A is just the idea of, is it this connection between purpose, humanity, and everything that we are dealing with and the changes that we need to make as communications people, marketing people, as business people during this crisis. I'm assuming really to some extent there are connections that will actually take us from we need to focus on purpose right now. Purpose must have this element of humanity. Maybe that's becomes more important through COVID. How should we be thinking about, those connections between this idea of purpose, humanity, and actually, the approach that we take as marketers and communicators in terms of reaching, are there direct connections between all of those ideas and actually changes to the marketing mix, for example? Maybe Rishad, you should start with your thoughts around that and then come back to you, Arun. So
I believe that, one of the key companies that everyone should study is PayPal. So PayPal is a company where Dan Schulman has actually spent tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, increasing the support he gives to his employees. So he did some research that basically indicated that 60% of his employees only had 3 to 4% disposable income after they paid their taxes, food, and housing. And he didn't believe that was enough. So he basically raised pay, gave everybody stock, reduced the cost of healthcare by 50% to them with the same healthcare, and then provided them with free financial education. To a great extent, what tends to happen is the way you look after your employees is really the way you, first of all, and most importantly, deliver purpose and value. If you cannot look after your employees, the rest of what you say is complete and utter bullshit, which is the key thing. Similarly, when you think about how Airbnb recently had to unfortunately get rid of 25% of the positions, read how they did it. It is absolutely incredible, right? Because they realize that those 25% are going to be either future enemies or potentially brand advocates in this place. So my first thing on purpose and values is if you basically make sure you look after employees, including when you have to do bad things like get rid of 25% of the positions. And in this case, he let them keep their computer, he let them vest all their stock, he gave them 1 year of healthcare, all kinds of stuff, right? You actually end up with a much more productive and powerful business because your employees are who interact with your customers. Your employees are the ones that basically without fear come up with ideas and innovation. Your employees are basically your biggest sales force, right? And so my whole basic belief is companies that talk about purpose and value and consider that their employees are the cost structure. You can keep talking about ESG, but you're just imagining stuff for the business roundtable. Wake up, my friends.
Arun, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, indeed. So when Rishad was talking, I was reminded of, there's a local store in Greenwich where I live in Stamford, in Connecticut, called Richards. So the guy who owns Richards is a clothing store. The guy who owns Richards, he's written a lot of books and he's got really good thoughts about marketing. So one day I was asking him, hey, what do you think is, in your mind, what is marketing? You've been so successful. He said there are two things. First, hug your employees. Second, hug your customers. That's it. He said everything else would be coming after that, right? What struck me about that, and I'm talking about the small business kind of thing there. What struck me in there was two things. Authenticity of this individual and this store, this chain, and they've got like 4 or 5 stores, and trust that they are building not only with the employees, but also they are building with their customers. And I think those are the 2 key pillars that Rishad was actually talking about. Authenticity and trust is the 2 key pillars, that connecting it back to the purpose of a company, right? And you cannot make it up. By the way, listen, I've worked for 20 years, I've worked in financial services, right? And there are a lot of companies that try and all that, and they try to make the purpose cannot be made up. It's got to come out of your brand DNA. Otherwise, it will be really fake. I'm sorry to say that, but it will be fake. So your brand DNA has to build that and has to have enough stretch in it that you can get to. Brand DNA doesn't mean something written on a piece of paper. I'm talking about the behavior of the employees, behavior of the management, behavior of your operating principles, the way you manage things and do things, right? And I think once you have that, it's a pure harmony. And that's what we got to strive for.
So just as a follow-up, one of the questions that we got is in terms of, as we talked a little bit about marketing mix. So as we're thinking about, so a couple of threads. There was one question that was actually, in the past, we've gone back, there've been other periods of crisis where people have gone back and looked at value and said, we need to, there have been these changes, but maybe they didn't last for very long. And one of the questions that we got was, how does the marketing mix, how long does the change in marketing mix actually last? Now, one thing we haven't talked a little bit about is, consistent with everything we've been talking about, what are the implications for the marketing mix? And does this last? In other words, if you're trying to convey purpose and humanity during a crisis, and by the way, at the same time you're running a company, you might be laying off people. You know, how do you manage that from a practical standpoint of, so do you change where your advertising dollars go, or is it becomes more digital in the mix? How do you think about those things from a nuts and bolts standpoint and the influences behind these decisions?
So, you know, and I can say that most companies that I'm associated with, they're changing the marketing mix, right? And some mix are simpler, like for example, not doing enough in sponsorship. So B2C companies, it's you know, they spend good 20%, if not more, of their entire marketing budget into all these sponsorships and all that. So you may not do that. But I think one of the marketing mix in there, like B2B companies have adopted extremely well. So events, look at what we are doing right now. So the B2B companies, most of their market spending goes into events, right? Generally, they're not doing advertising and all that beyond digital, but they have adapted really well. Instead of in-person events, they're doing webinar and they're saving money and all of those things, right? In my last company, we used to do literally about 3,000 events a year, which means 10 events a day. 10 events, I'm talking about the global element of it, right? So globally, we used to do 10 events a day. Those, and we used to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in it. Now, the marketing mix is going to change. All of those events are happening with webinar, and there will be an overload on the webinar side of it and all of those things. So there will be some backlash coming in there, and people are already zoomed out. I mean, they've been from morning till night, you know, been on Zoom. So there's going to be a lot of backlash. So some of those are easier ones to kind of connect, but there are some longer term impact in there. Longer term is your value proposition is going to change. And that is the ones who manage well during the crisis by changing their value proposition, staying closer to your customers and employees, of course, and customers. They are the ones who are going to be the long-term winners. You know, I remember at the last crisis in 2008, I was the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer of Zurich Financials. Went to the board on September 8th. I still remember the date of 2007. And I said, we need to really launch a campaign in 140 countries. Rishad's publicist was helping me at that time, that agency. And the board pushed me back. Board said, hey, this is, you know, the whole world is coming to us, you know, screeching halt, and you're asking us to spend money. And my logic to them at that point was, this is the time that differentiates between good and the best. And if you really want to be the best, then we need to spend this, spend it and do it quickly and do it. And so we ended up launching one of the largest campaigns in the world, 140 countries all at one time, right? But that's a huge risk. I mean, there's not many companies which would be willing to take that risk. And the reason why we took that risk, because the campaign was based on the customer centricity element of it. And it's a financial services, which is very maligned in terms of customer centricity. We were bringing in Help Point, which is a customer centricity element in there. And that's why it became very authentic and acceptable by customers. And that lasted for a good 10 plus years from a campaign standpoint. And you still see, for example, on farmers, which is some other agency did that for me at that point, for farmers, you know, that campaign has been running for almost like 15 years now. So long-term value can be had during these crisis changes and changes with the marketing mix.
Rishad, if you can maybe share some perspective. One of the questions that's just come in is, you know, since we're talking about human beings, we're talking about purpose, and we've been talking about employees. The questioner is really actually about, you know, people, the employees, the talent, who gets hired, how do, you know, what may actually change from a company standpoint about people in this process? And are there going to be things that are different priorities to be successful when it comes to people?
I would say some of them, there would be some changes, or certain things would be more emphasized versus others less emphasized. The first thing that you have to recognize is you will always be looking for capability. You will be looking for some combination of IQ and EQ, because you need someone, in the business world, you not only have to be smart, but you have to learn to deal with people and communicate and connect, etc. All of that will be important. I think the two biggest things that we look for, but now I think we'll look for even more, is the ability to learn. Because we're moving in a world where the rate of change is moving faster and faster. And we're moving in a change where technology and society is moving faster than most of our analog brains can handle. So I always now look for not only curiosity, but how have you learned, how have you adapted, how have you aligned with forces? So one will clearly be that. And then the other one will be resilience. Because what's coming through increasingly is there will be more and more shocks to our system. Hopefully nothing like this. Okay, this is hopefully once in 100 years. But there are going to be more and more shocks to the system. So I think you're going to be looking for people who are learners, curious self-learners, and who also happen to basically be resilient. And usually what I tend to find is that aligns with a trait called humor and not taking themselves too seriously.
Great. John, do you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, I think the one last question that I would have is really one that I always like to ask when I'm recruiting people or evaluating anything that I'm looking at when I'm thinking about all the questions that I've asked. And it's the question of, what should we have asked today that perhaps we didn't ask? Arun and Rishad, is there something that when you think about it and you step back and say, the world is in many ways coming apart and we're going to all put it back together again somehow. The big reset button on the globe that was on the visual that we created today, and the theme of all of this in terms of reset, are there some closing thoughts that you have around advice that you would give to anyone who is thinking about how do they now go back into their organization, their roles? What can they be really prioritizing to do differently that we haven't touched on today? Any final comments from each of you?
So I have one, which is, and that's basically because almost everybody here is a leader, and I think all individuals are leaders, is what does leadership look like and the importance of leadership. And I did a lot of research over the years, and I developed this thing called Leading with Soul, right, which is one of the chapters of my book. And there are 5 characteristics of leaders. And I would just ask you all to put these 5 characteristics up against yourselves, and then just to see how it works, put it up against any 3 or 4 politicians that you're listening to. Because at any given time, you're listening to your mayor, you're listening to your governor, you're listening to the president of the United States, and maybe someone else. And just put these 5. I won't tell you what to think, but here are the 5. And these are long before COVID-19. So the first one is a leader has to be capable and competent, and has to execute capability and competence, because you don't follow people who are not capable and competent, especially in times of pressure. The second one is integrity. And that integrity has that key word that Arun mentioned, which is trust. The other one is realist, data-driven, scientific, okay? The third happens to basically be empathy. Do they understand and do they care about you, or do they only care about themselves? Especially today when most employees are under massive pressure and fragility. The fourth is vulnerability. Can you explain to people that you yourself don't know what you're doing? You're making decisions really fast. There's a gun to your head. You're trying to do all kinds of things. And the fifth one is inspiration, that there is something better. And so to a great extent, are people capable, competent? Do they have integrity? They use facts and data. Is there vulnerability? Is there empathy? And is there inspiration? And you should be doing that, because I will tell you one thing, and I truly agree. we are in a time where all of us are in a furnace. People are watching us and we are going to be forged. And whether we come out like coal or diamonds is up to us, but people are watching us. And the easier for you to be diamonds is to follow these 5 characteristics that basically follow the opposite of these 5 characteristics. And I will just leave it at that and try it against any politician, and you'll begin to see what I think.
Yeah, so that's really well said, Rishad. I will just add a couple of things to that part of it. I mean, it's probably understood in your criteria already, right? To me, someone who in this situation, especially, it's very relevant, is someone who is very change oriented, and you have to be resilient enough to lead that and say, okay, how do I really, you got to be an optimist. You got to make sure that people connect with you. You got to make sure that you can show them the vision, all those things that Rishad talked about. But especially the change orientation, because that helps you from trying innovation, trying new things, trying old things, and then leading it to the next level aspect of it. So that's one last thing I would add, and related to that, I would say is resilience. We will overcome this. Doesn't matter how bad it. So when you're going through a situation looks really bad, we're awful, tough, we will come out of this. And I think that's what we need to prepare for, is when we come out of it, how do we really build that? How do we really make sure that the whole world is with us on this?
Thank you both for those closing thoughts. And I want to thank our audience for your questions. If there's any that we were not able to get to, we'll try to incorporate responses to those in some of our follow-up communications. The COVID-19 reset is really not only a requirement for all leaders to address, but I think, as you heard here today, also an opportunity for leaders and their teams, internal and external, and we're talking about leaders at every level of the organization, to engage, to directly connect strategy, marketing, communications, and really maximize value. So on behalf of Simon and me and our supporting partners and everyone in our audience today, I really want to thank Arun and Rishad for sharing their valuable time, their perspective, their insights, and guidance with us at this very critical reset point in each of our journeys. I'd ask you all to please mark your calendars for the next session of this series, which will be on Wednesday, June 24th at 12 noon Eastern Time. The registration details for that event are going to be sent to all participants of today's webinar. It will also be posted very shortly on the Council website and our LinkedIn pages. We really hope that you continue to join us in this complimentary series as it progresses. That next session is going to pick right off where we left off today, and I think bring together. We're assembling a great group of panelists for that are going to address the aspects of both the behavioral side of it, the leadership side of it, the kinds of support leaders need, whether it be coaching, whether it be additional project management, external resources. Where do we really go to for all of the resources that we need to get through this? And we really hope that you'll be able to join us for that. In the meantime, we really hope that each of you, your families, your friends, and your business teams stay safe and stay well. Thank you again for joining us today.